Hey, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for taking time to come to this presentation webinar for EU JAMRI Work Package 9 on access. It's our pleasure today to welcome Professor Mina Tadrous, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. His research area focuses on drug safety and health services research. And I think we'll just start the presentation so that we have a lot of time for discussion. So Mina, over to you.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for having me. I will I will try to cover a lot in about 30 minutes or so we can save a lot for questions. I know there's always really great conversations around this topic, especially when I'm lucky enough to present to a group of experts such as yourselves, who are dealing with this issue head on. So let me share my slides. Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to be presenting to you is work that we've been doing that's built on top of like a decade of work, but it really is concentrated in the last 2 years. And like many people around the world, like around, many countries, Canada's been kind of grappling with shortages, but we've kind of had a very big regulatory and policy push ever since the pandemic, and we're kind of trying to cash in on some of that work. And this was my attempt to improve what I believe is happening around the world to address this issue. And I'm really excited to share with you. So I don't have any current or past relationships with commercial entities. Some of the work that's being presented today, I've received funding for drug shortages from our regulator, from our pharmacy association. I have received from insurance companies because we have a private public system in Canada, but I've never done any work for the pharmaceutical industry. I will flag that some of the things I'm presenting today are currently an invention that's owned by the University of Toronto that's being commercialized, but we can talk about that in a different setting. But it's just important to recognize that that's in the progress of what's happening. So, I think the basis for a lot of my work comes from my foundation as a pharmacist. And as a pharmacist, we know that when shortages hit, I always was kind of troubled by the fact that one, it felt like we were powerless and we were constantly told there's nothing that can be done. And in large part, as a person who studies policy and does policy impactful work, what I realized was happening is that our drug systems were built on a process in which we evaluated drug by drug or drug class by drug class. A new drug comes in, we do the RCTs, we do the HTA, we figure out what's happening. What we were really bad at is the moment we have to flip it and we have to choose from the thousands of drugs that we're lucky to have and select from them what we need to do. And when we flip that pyramid upside down, instead of going from, the singular drug that goes into the system, we kind of buckle. Also the complexity of it, right? Like every single drug has multiple indications. When I see a drug, I'm instantly thinking, which patients are going to get hit the hardest? Which ones can I hold off? Do I have therapeutic options? What's going to cost the system? Can I switch patients? Do I have any options? And that complexity, I think, is the problem in all of this and what really makes it a very big issue. The other thing is, as I was reading a lot of the literature, the definition of a drug shortage, and it's so funny, like every area struggles with a definition of something. The literature was kind of split. But to me, it's really in the end of the day, when that patient comes into the pharmacy or they're sitting in that bed in the hospital, am I able to give them the drug or not? And a lot of the literature that everyone was building policies around was actually not built on that. It was all built on what's the probability of a supply chain disruption. But then when you look at the definitions by Health Canada, the FDA, ASHP, it's always related to demand, the ability or the inability to meet the demand of the drug. And yet all of the literature that we read is about supply chain disruptions. And as a pharmacist, I knew time and time again, I would see supply chain reports coming in. I'd go to my wholesaler to order the drug and it was still there. And I'll show you in a bit, but our research shows that 9 out of 10 times that was all okay. And it was never an issue. And so I think it really raises the issue of, are we measuring the right thing and are we doing this correctly? No doubt it's a problem. Here in Canada, 1 in 4 Canadians experience a drug shortage every 2 years. Thousands of drug shortages at the level of like a strength, hundreds in the US. I think this is a global issue. And I don't think I need to sell it to anybody that this is happening all over the country and all over the place. One of the main problems, again, was also understanding the reasons why, right? So I think this is daunting. This is our attempt to simplify the supply chain. And you can see that every single one of these arrows, first of all, happens likely in a different country, if not a different side of the world. And in each one of these, there's a potential for things to go wrong. And I think that that's like a very challenging thing to deal with when you feel like you don't understand or you have any power over it. It's not even inside the borders of your own country. But funny enough, most countries actually don't even know how much drug they have inside of their own country. At best, they can guesstimate it, but it's very challenging to do so. And so we're constantly unable to make these requirements. And there's lots of theories and things that go on that can happen. And one of the most important examples that I always give people is that some of the biggest shortages that have ever happened in North America were actually due to manufacturing optimizations. When there was a consolidation of companies, they tried to optimize. It wasn't anything got shut down. It wasn't a failed inspection. It wasn't a hurricane. It was this. And I think it's really important to recognize that the supply chains are fragile. And this becomes important as we have conversations and threats of tariffs and geopolitical issues to recognize that we need to understand the stability of them in a way that helps us understand them. With that being said, weather events, climate change, it's going to continue to be an issue. And I think the concentration of it, for example, is like when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, which was devastating for the island of Puerto Rico, we saw ripples of IV and biologic shortages around the world because there was so much concentration in a single place. And I think that this speaks again to being able to understand our redundancy and to be able to understand what's happening around the world. And the last thing, and I think this is no news to anybody else, is we studied and monitored during the pandemic the supply chain and what was happening. And one thing we also realized is that we need to take into account human and system natures. So, for example, when we started to create policies around limiting drug supply, we saw blips an increase. This is a figure showing the kind of like uptake of drugs from chronic drugs. And you can see a big blip because we changed the way that drugs are being dispensed. So our policies have impacts, which means the moment you change a policy, your supply chain is impacted. The second is we saw consumers act a certain way. Toilet paper syndrome and people flocking. I don't know if this happened in Europe, but it definitely happened in North America. This right here is the infamous hydroxychloroquine, right? And we did a paper that looked at what impacted it more, meta-analyses or tweets. And you can imagine which one was the more statistically significant one in that era. And then the last was that it's not just people, but also systems. This is salbutamol or SABA inhalers. And when the pandemic hit, there was a concern that it was going to be respiratory, so people were grabbing as many inhalers as they could. All the hospitals were switching from the nebulized formulations to the inhalers to minimize disease spread. And when that happened, everyone started ordering it to the point where in Canada, we had such a shortage that we had to actually import foreign labeled inhalers. And we were lucky enough to be able to get some from Poland. And so we had all these like Polish labeled inhalers during the pandemic to be able to do this. And I think it's like, again, it's the human nature of what our policies do and what happens when we announce things in that way. The other thing that was always kind of interesting to me is that the system was agnostic to the clinical importance and the impacts of drug shortages. And every shortage was not the same, right? So we know that the same shortages or different shortages can hit and they have different impacts. For example, there's a really great JAMA paper on the norepinephrine shortage. So norepinephrine hits, mortality goes up. Why? We don't have, it's the best, right? Like the thing we're going to after it, phenylephrine, is inferior. And so people passed away. In contrast, valsartan, which was a massive shortage around the world, we studied the hell out of this in the US, Canada, and Europe. And basically, what we saw is that because we had all these other therapeutic options and it's a treatment that's like a preventative treatment, we're able to switch patients over. That's not to say that it wasn't a pain in the butt, but it still didn't kill people in the same way that norepinephrine did, which raises the issue that clinically, not every shortage is the same. And yet, why do we treat them all the same in that way? But there are some that have massive impacts. This is data out of Canada where we looked at the number of people that were impacted by that valsartan shortage. So the same one that I said didn't kill people, but 160,000 Canadians in a single week had to be transferred, had to have faxes. We still use fax machines, had to have new lab tests, had to be transferred over. And that's a very big thing. And the last thing is that it can really have an impact on how the public treats it. We had a analgesic shortage for children's Tylenol or acetaminophen or paracetamol, sorry. Um, and people started trying to make it at home. And this is a paper that showed a climb in the number of poison control calls after the shortage when people tried to make their own children's Tylenol at home. And I think it's important to recognize what this does to people and the impacts of it. And this children's Tylenol shortage is the one that tipped the policy scale in Canada and made drug shortages a prime ministerial mandate for us to be working on. We've done a number of kind of reviews, and I'm sure in many of the jurisdictions you're in, you're seeing a lot of pressure thinking about all the policies that can happen. And there's lots of interesting policies that we can do. But the problem is that all the policies, a lot of them, especially if they're preventative, cost money. And so the question becomes, you can't do all of these policies for all drugs in most cases. So if you're creating a stockpile or you're creating public-private partnership or you're importing certain drugs or whatever it may be, that costs money. And that means that you have to be able to think of a way to prioritize the drugs. Sorry. And so this ability to prioritize becomes the gold rush in the last few years. And I think many of you are sitting in places where we started to see the emergence of lists, right? So we see Australia put out a list based on pricing. France picked 50 drugs drawn from 450 drugs. Canada, we created a tier 3 list. The WHO and FDA created essential medicines list. And this is where I had a problem. And I think I've been around this world quite a bit that I saw how these lists were created. I saw, what goes into the sausage, as they say. And the problem I always found is that, one, it wasn't taking into account the right things that we were thinking about. And I think to me, it was really important, and I hope I sold this to you really quickly. The thing that was most important that we should be taking into account is one, not every drug has the same supply chain risk, right? So that risk of like where things are made, how it's made, we can look at that. And the second is clinically, not every drug is the same, and we have to be very candid about that. The other problem I saw was how we made lists. We love to bring experts into a room, we draw all of these lists, and then we ask everyone's opinions. And the moment you ask people's opinions about drugs, they're drawn to their own biases. And the joke I make is that if you had an expert opinion about which drugs are most critical to a country and a dermatologist in that room, there's no way you're going to leave that room and you don't feel like you need to put a cream on there, right? And I'm not saying that creams aren't important. I'm just saying like that person's going to say, well, this is what I think is important because that's their lens. And so what happens is these lists either get too big or they're actually not addressing the issues and they weren't systematic in nature, their opinions at very best. And that is what we tried to solve for, is how do we do this in this way? And so to me, any list that a country creates or anything that we do has to meet 4 tenets. The first has to be systematic. We have to eliminate opinions. We can have policy opinions at the end that fine tune it, but the way that we narrow it down has to always be systematic in nature so that we can work through those thousands of drugs. What are we forgetting? What are we not thinking about? Like, this is really important stuff. The second is it has to be adaptable, right? I showed you the moment that you in place a policy, that list is out of date. The moment you do anything, that list is out of date. The third is it has to be transparent. You have to trust it. You can't, it's not going to work like selecting the Pope. We can't just wait for the smoke to come out of the building and we know what the list is. People want to know how it was made. And any list that doesn't show that becomes very critical and people are very critical of it. And the fourth is it has to be updatable. The factors that you put in change over time. And so this is not the 10 Commandments. So the moment that you write these things in, you can't pretend like that list is going to last forever. Evidence changes, drugs change, the world changes, and it means that anything you do has to be updatable. And the way that we develop these lists is not adaptive, it's not updatable, it's not transparent, it's definitely not systematic. So to me, we had to be able to create a tool that helps decision makers work through this, that is takes into account the supply chain, that understands clinical risk, and then most importantly, it's policy agnostic. So we know that everyone in the ecosystem is working on different things. And so this list or this tool has to be adaptive to the ways that we can do it, because a list that produces a factory that the country is sponsoring is very different from a stockpile, is very different from a procurement strategy, right? And so all of those have to be adaptive in that nature. And it has to take this into account. And so that's what we worked on for the last 2 years. The way we did it is a 3-phased approach. The first phase is we developed evidence. We did some scoping reviews that I'll show you very quickly. We developed a predictive model that was data driven that tells us what's the probability of a shortage that impacts patients, not the supply chain issue, but impacts actual patients. We brought experts together from every single corner of the ecosystem. So wholesalers, distributors, manufacturers, hospitals, policymakers, clinicians, you name it. They were at the table. We brought them in. And when we asked them, I never asked them what drug should be on this list, what drug should be in the tool. I asked them, what's important to consider? Here's our framework. And we talked about the framework. And then the last is we posted the tool and we got people to just use it. And we got feedback and we got consultations there. And the broader course, like the real meat and potatoes of what we do, is I think any decision should account for these two things. I believe, and we've proven it, that you can predict the supply chain risk of a drug, sort of like a cardiovascular risk score. So I'm not saying that I know exactly, I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I would not be here. I'd be buying stocks and hanging out on a beach. But what we do know is that similar to a cardiovascular risk score, if you know someone has a family history, they smoke, they don't take care of themselves, they're of a certain age, you can say that they're more likely to have a heart attack. They may not, right? And someone who's really young, healthy, takes care of themselves, has no family history, is less likely, but they may. But you're also willing to do that. And I think with drugs, we can look at the number of manufacturers, generics and brands, formulations, and I'll show you what we did in a second. In clinical risk, we can measure that systematically and know that we want drugs to percolate to the top that are life-saving, that are more acute, that don't have good therapeutic options, all the way down to drugs that maybe it would be nice if it went on shortage and disappeared so we don't have to deal with it anymore. And it's the balance of that. What I'm saying is, me as a taxpayer, as a country, if I'm going to stockpile a drug, I want my country to stockpile norepinephrine that I showed you that saved lives, and I probably don't need valsartan. Not saying I don't need valsartan in the system. I just don't want to invest as much resources because it's not as important based on that risk. And it's the balancing of the two that really develops our framework. That's what we want to be able to look at, and that's what we want to be able to develop. And so to build the foundation for this, we did these environmental scans and we did these predictive models. Very briefly, to understand this, we did 3 environmental scans. The first is we looked to better understand harms, and it helped us understand the diversity of impacts and what factors are important to consider. The second is we looked at utilization. What are the factors that go into impacting utilization when a shortage hits? And the third is we tried to find, is there a systematic way for us to look at clinical importance? So with harms, it's what you believe. Like lots of drugs have been studied. We found 1 scoping review, 22 randomized studies across a variety of different areas. But basically what we saw is that it varies. And it was really important to take into account how important a drug is. Does it have therapeutic options? And those were things that were built into the tool that we built out there. The second thing we saw is that the impact of utilization really does vary. So some shortages hit and things carry on. Some shortages hit and things really drop off. And so there's a massive variation from 0.29% all the way to 99% of losing your drugs. And so I think it's important to consider what those risk factors are and the drug characteristics, the types of drugs, the number of manufacturers on the market. Those are all factors that had to be built in. And the last is we were able to find tools, and I'm going to show you in a second what that is, that we were able to adapt and then innovate on and validate to be able to use in the drug shortage scale. And what we were able to do is find this tool that basically clinicians can use, and I'll get to our methodology in a second of how we did this. But for every drug, we could look at it and say, how severe is the disease being treated here? What is the size of the population? How important is it to our system? Where is it listed in clinical guidelines? Are there other interventions is there an unmet need? What's its improvement on efficacy? What's its improvement on safety compared to other products? What's its improvement on patient-reported outcomes, right? Like, is this a product that perhaps we can give once a day versus 3 times a day, and that's a really good thing? What's the type of medical service? Is it a cure, right? Like, does this help cure people and save lives? And the last, what's the public health interest? If I stop using this, is disease going to spread even more? You can imagine there's a lot of drugs in the space that many of you think about that would fall into this. And each of these could be categorized into a score of 3. And there's a weighting in the background that people don't know that helps you score it. And you get a score out of 100 that tells you how clinically important a product is. And this is what we used. And I'll talk about how we did that in 1 second. So based on all that information, we went and started to develop a predictive model. So we knew that we wanted to measure real impact. So what we were going to do is look at real world utilization, not just was there a supply chain shortage or not. And what we did is a population-based cross-sectional time series where we matched drugs that had a supply chain issue with drugs that did not, and then we followed them forward. And what we wanted to know, so what we did is we basically looked for the average utilization, and then we looked for a 33% drop. The reason we use 33% is, as many of you know, um, drug utilization happens in a sawtooth pattern. And so if you say 5, 10%, you pick up a lot of false positives. And we found that when we did a validation study at 33%, we eliminate all the false positives. Like when that drop happens, that's a real shortage. And it drops from like 20% all the way to 90, I think it was 85% specificity that that's a shortage there. And so that's why we use this definition moving forward. And so you can imagine what we're able to then do is we can match drugs that had a supply chain issues with those that did not. We follow them forward. We see if a shortage happens. We control for a bunch of covariates. That model helps us build some sort of association between all those factors. We then can then figure out what that association is, and we can go back based on that weighting and score every single drug that we have in the country. And with that, we can give a score between 0 and 100. So it's a bit analogous for those who are familiar with the propensity score of we can figure something out and then we can give a propensity of having that issue there. And we took into account everything from the ATCs, the formulations, the unit price, the age of the drug, the number of manufacturers active in the market, sales market sizes, was it an essential medicine, does it have therapeutic alternatives, the number of active ingredients in it, the number of DINs, which are the unique products, like the number of strengths that are in the market, the public coverage. So we have a public-private system, and so we actually found that something that's publicly covered gets more market access. The schedule it's in, is it over the counter? Is it behind? Is it in the hospital? Provider administered, was it a tier 3? Is it a brand or generic? We also added in later on market concentration. We added in has it had a previous shortage before? And what setting is it most used in? And all of these factors went into the model. And what we were able to do is kind of build this predictive model there. And we found that many of them that you can see starred here are significant. So a lot. And they come in different weights. And so, some of the biggest factors were around the ATC categories. So interesting to this group, like anti-infectives are really high risk. And there's a variety of different reasons that we can talk about there of why that happens. Certain formulations are very high risk. It's protective, funny enough, to have had a shortage previously. I think that I call that the post shortage trauma, where we overcompensate and likely order too much of a drug once we've been impacted by it. And so there's lots of factors that go into that. And interestingly enough, my gut as a pharmacist was true. So 1 in 10 shortages. So when a supply chain risk shortage supply chain issue hits, 9 out of 10 times it doesn't matter. Nothing happens. And this is constantly true, but it's that 1 out of 10 times. And this kind of refutes why all that previous evidence was interesting. And I don't want to say it's not good, but that this model is a little bit better and more important to consider when there's actual utilization there. How did it do? So after we built the predictive model, we looked forward for the next 2 years, right? So and we said, how many of them actually had a shortage after that? And so the ones that we placed at a higher risk, so they were this was only a list of about 75 drugs. 20% of them had a shortage in that next year to 2 years. In contrast, the other group, which is like everything else that wasn't in the caution, had 6.3%. Some sort of shortage happened to them that was statistically significant. So we were able to say, like, you're basically improving your bet by 300% above the average. And I think it's really important to consider that. And visually, when you look at that, what that means is that here's the actual shortage, here's the predicted percentage amounts. And so even with our predicted score, you're able to kind of look at them in a much better way. And so what was happening is people were making the wrong bets. And, funny enough, we saw people coming that were doing procurements or doing a lot of different work where they were selecting these drugs out and they were making the wrong bets on these drugs. And I think it's important to consider what this means to making those right selections. So in Canada, feels like a lifetime ago, about 5 months ago, on December 28th, they had a mandate to get it done by the end of the year. So they put it out just at the buzzer. Health Canada announced the critical and vulnerable drug list, and they used our list to help them select it out. And this was an interesting activity because what they were able to do is instead of just taking, so they didn't take the predictive score of probability. What they did is they took our clinical importance score and they looked at how clinically important drugs are, and then they used the supply chain risk to help them select those out. And what we've built is this kind of neat dashboard where you can go in and you can kind of look at the drugs and you can imagine that you can see where their risk is. So high risk drugs are drugs that were clinically important. So they're in the top quadrant, the top 20% of drugs in clinical importance, and they're in the top 10% of risk of supply chain. And then you can actually play around with it and pick things out based on formulation, ATC, and it can help people use it in a variety of different ways. And we're combining this with a whole bunch of other tools that we're going to be building a discussion board to build a community. We're building an AI tool to help clinicians respond to things. So we're starting to see that there's a big demand for other things to help people respond. But it really starts with making those better decisions. And the last tenet, if you remember, about this tool that we talked about was that it's really important that it's a policy agnostic thing because everyone uses it a little bit differently. The regulator used it to help explore buffer stock policy, so mandating that. So how do you select which drugs you want to keep more of in the country? Hospital managers have been using it to reduce and keep a little extra stock of certain drugs. Purchasers and wholesalers have been using it to make strategic procurement. So if you're putting out a procurement strategy, there's certain drugs that they want to make sure that they have multiple manufacturers for to have redundancy. It's costly if you do that for every drug. It defeats the purpose of procurement and getting a better deal because the moment you bring in a second person to split the market, your price goes up. But you want to do that for the right drugs. And we actually had a GPO, so a group purchasing organization, that did this. And what they found is that if they used our tool, they could have saved millions of dollars because they made the bet on wrong drugs and they should have made the bet on some drugs that ended up costing them because they had to bring other drugs in. And so you can imagine when you're trying to make those bets, this is where it's beneficial. And the last, and this was an interesting one, we have a public-private partnership where the government is funding a not-for-profit entity to produce some drugs. And a lot of countries are starting to do this. They were using the tool to figure out what drug should they make, right? And they had some specifications, like they couldn't do orals, they could do IVs, they had to do, so you can imagine like to narrow down a list and then work through it saves them a lot of time. It also helps them zoom in on what they think is important. And manufacturers are technically using it to think through this work. And the last thing is that this tool has to be responsive to new data. So we've already been working on the updates, and I can tell you, like within a month of one update, you see about 30 to 40 drugs move because a new manufacturer comes in, the price moves, a generic comes in, a new brand product comes in. Products are constantly being done, and so what we envision is a tool that could be updated every month or two. The model needs to be recalibrated at least every year. And the thing is that the clinical scores have to be constantly made and updated in a lot of different ways. And so the way that we did the clinical scores is we got independent clinicians to score the tool. So each one of them would independently score it. And what we would basically do is the clinicians would review it. We would have if after three clinicians, if there's a disagreement, we bring in more clinicians. We then would have an AI tool score it as well. And if there's a disagreement there, we keep scoring it until we have some sort of pattern of agreement there. And the vision we have is that we're going to constantly be rescoring the drugs, getting more and more clinicians. So we're crowdsourcing the scores. And you can imagine that improves it. And as evidence emerges, the scores will improve over time. And that's kind of the area that's there. I did want to flag before we jump in that a few emerging areas that I think might be important to this group that we've been thinking about as well. The first is, I think it's become very obvious as the US has become defensive that we need to think locally, but we need to act globally. And we don't talk quite enough. I'm sure this table is a really great place where you guys are talking between countries and jurisdictions, but we feel in North America, we don't talk quite enough about what happens in supply chains. And it's important to recognize that, right? This is a study we did where we looked at what exactly happened on March 2020. And that massive blip is every country stockpiling. We had no coordinated effort. No one cared. We were just doing our own thing. And no country didn't do this, right? So when you look at the variation around the world, every country started to stockpile and do this. And this led to a number of shortages. We don't have any agreements. We don't talk about things at all. And I think it's important to recognize that we need to start talking about how do we coordinate this. If every country now is starting to stockpile and create drug shortage things, this may lead to issues. So we need to be talking to each other and letting the manufacturers know that this is happening, or we're going to trigger our own shortages as we all try to protect ourselves and develop smart policies. I'm worried we're going to have another March 2020 as everybody is doing this. The other thing that's obvious is that when one ripple happens, it happens around the world. So when Valsartan had the recall, because there was nitrosamine, which is like a carcinogenic agent that was found in it, a number of products were recalled around the world. And you can see here, all countries, there's a drop. And in developed countries where we have really strong regulators, there's a massive drop that happens in a lot of countries. Interestingly, in poor countries, what we saw is an increase. And in some poor countries, there was double or tripling of valsartan being going there. And the timing was that it happened at the same month. And so it's very concerning to me that as some recalled drug is being pulled from countries, it may be ending up in some other countries. And I'm sure that this happens a lot. And I think it's important to recognize that the wealthier countries are impacting other countries in the way that we distribute drugs and we go about there. And it's important to recognize that shortages hit a lot of us at the same time, and then we start to compete with each other. And we did an analysis where we looked at the same shortages hitting all the countries. We looked at 80 countries. And what we saw is that the biggest predictor of where the shortages were the worst was the GDP. Didn't matter the price they paid, didn't matter the number of manufacturers. Like, it didn't matter at the country level. But when you looked at which countries were able to bounce back faster, so we need to recognize that there is sort of a competition that's happening there. And I do believe that we are hurting each other if we don't work well together in that way. And I think the last thing, and this is very important to consider, is I do think that the tariffs, if countries start doing this to each other and companies start to maneuver around. So, I was at a conference last week, and, one company was very proud. They're like, don't worry, like, if there's a tariff from the US, like, we're just going to move the distribution from one place to another and we're going to be fine. That scares me because, like I told you, the worst shortages I've ever seen in my lifetime were when companies started to maneuver things around. These are not nimble things. This is not moving your lamp from one side of the bed to the other. The moment you try to move things around, there are opportunities for things to go wrong. And you multiply this by thousands of drugs across different countries. And so I'm very concerned as we do this in a very urgent way, and like the chaos of every weekend waiting for a tweet to announce what's going to happen is going to be detrimental. And I think we need to have our guards up that there could be supply chain constraints. And we need to start working with like-minded countries to say, well, how can we protect ourselves against it for certain drugs that are important there? So as promised, I covered it in 30 minutes. And I'm happy to kind of have a conversation about what we've done, lessons we've learned, and I would love to learn about what you guys are working on to be there. But thank you again for the opportunity to come talk to all of you about some of the work that's happening here in Canada.
Thank you so much, Mina. That was excellent. And I guess we can say that we are lucky that we have strong production of antibiotics in Europe. So that I'm going to stop the recording now so that